you very much. Thank you, Prabhu, and thank you for the invitation again to take part in the Drucker Forum. The piano concerto that I played, that was simply the most terrifying public performance that I've ever done until now, where I have to, following the strict rules of the Drucker Forum timing, present to you 9 of the most interesting people you will hear from at this conference within the space of 1 hour. So we're not going to be able to take direct questions from the floor. I will be keeping an eye on Slido, though, and trying to bring in any thoughts that you might have. The format is going to be in 2 halves. In the first half, our panelists that you see before you here, Maëlle Gavet, John Hagel, Tammy Erickson, Tawfik Jelassi, and in the second half, the other 5 panelists in your program, and there'll be obviously a handover at the halfway point. Can I urge you not to leave the room during the final session, because if you do so, you will really be like the people who leave before the final firework display, which you have to admit is a pretty depressing way to go about living your life if you miss the big rockets at the end. We are going to focus on what Kurt in the last full panel told us to do, which is to talk about the move from the what to the how of bringing the entrepreneurial society into being. And so I want to start by asking Maëlle to kick us off in answering a big question, which I think is implicit in a lot of the discussion that we've had today and yesterday, which is how can we ensure that an entrepreneurial society is also a better society? If we assume that an entrepreneurial society is a good thing, which Peter Drucker did and which we presumably do, how can we ensure it's also a better society? Maëlle.
That's a very good question. So I'll start by saying that I have a strong bias because I've been working in tech for over 10 years. And as many of you know, tech companies tend to worship, sometimes to the extreme, entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship. And these companies have in their DNA this love of disruption and speed. And so the entrepreneurial society for tech companies is something that most people really believe that is going to make the world a better place. But when I think about what we need to ensure to make an entrepreneurial society a better society, I think there are 3 points that I would keep in mind. The first one is that entrepreneurial society tend to believe that you make your own success, which means that we believe that to a certain extent you're responsible also for your own failures. And while I generally agree with the fact that you're in charge of your own destiny, I think we need to be very careful about the fact that your failure and sometimes your success as well are more the result of your environment than they are of your work. And what that means is that we need to be very careful about people that by these standards may not be as successful as we think they should be, to make sure that they are a part of this society, that they're not excluded, that they feel valuable no matter what. The second point is that in a society that values entrepreneurship above all, we tend to welcome, encourage disruption, and we like companies' reinvention. We praise companies for reinventing themselves on a regular basis. We believe in flexibility and in self-organization. And while, again, I believe that from a high-level perspective, that makes a lot of sense and that really makes society better in the long term, we need to keep reminding ourselves that at the individual level, this disruption disrupts real people with real families, and that these people at some point may prefer stability and security over entrepreneurship if that entrepreneurship means too much disruption in their life. And then the last point I'll make, and I think Mariana Mazzucato yesterday did a wonderful presentation about that, is the role of the state and the fact that in a society which is very focused on entrepreneurship, we tend to give a disproportionate place to individual entrepreneurs and companies, and we make them the hero of our society. And because of that, our policy making tends to be shaped by this idea, and it also means that we tend to disproportionately distribute rewards for growth to these people not necessarily in relation with the distribution of risk. And that to me means that there is a strong role for government that needs to be there. A healthy entrepreneurial society is also a society where the state is a very entrepreneurial one. So we need a society which is diverse, inclusive, with a state that plays fully its role.
Okay, so while we're talking on government, I don't want to rerun the discussion of last night on the role of the state, but Tawfik, as some of you may know, served in the technocratic government of Tunisia and as Minister of Education looked to reform education to bring young Tunisians, graduates off the street and on into entrepreneurial, self-employed roles. So how did that experience shape what you now think would make a better entrepreneurial society?
Thank you for that. First of all, this came out of the blue. Before that, I was an academic for 30 years between USA and Europe. I wasn't a politician. And a few years ago, out of the blue, came a phone call from the new Prime Minister of Tunisia, somebody I did not know, offering me to be his Minister of Higher Education, Research and Technology. I was Paris-based at the time. How many of you would have accepted this job? You had left your home country 35 years earlier. You never returned to live full-time there, nor to work full-time there. And you are in a post-revolution Tunisia. And you are asked to lead 3 ministries, and you are not a politician. And although my family was strongly opposed to it, I accepted the job, went there, and the first thing I noticed is that half of the jobless people in the country are university graduates, thousands of whom had a master's or PhD degree in science, in technology, etc. So I felt my first priority should be to reform the higher education system and to move from education for employment to education for self-employment. Why? Because government was overstaffed, couldn't create new jobs, and private sector was mainly made of small or medium-sized enterprises and couldn't create the hundreds of thousands of new jobs per year that the country needed. So what is left? I thought we have to teach these young people entrepreneurship, management, business modeling, fundraising, and the like. And we have to give them the confidence upon graduation so they can use the competence they got to launch projects, startups. So we created incubators in higher education institutions. We had 2 state banks to finance startups and give microloans. We started hiring tutors and coaches to hold these young men and women by the hand and show them how to become an entrepreneur. And fundamentally, to change the mindset, to say, yes, you wanted to become a civil servant and have job security for life, or you wanted to be employed by a large company. But since that did not materialize, instead of sitting in cafes all day long, why don't you go to the incubators or accelerators or technology parks and try to do something meaningful for yourself, something good for your family, and something good for society?
I know it was an agonizing process, and you met opposition in the things that you were trying to do. Is it possible just to boil down for us perhaps the 2 things that you were essentially trying to get across to these young people to make them into entrepreneurs? What were the kind of 2 things you were trying to get them to, ways that you were trying to get them to think in order to take this entrepreneurial path?
Well, part of my message that the Arab Spring that started in Tunisia in January 2011, the slogans of the protesters in the face of the dictator at the time were, we want freedom, we want the jobs, we want dignity. What is the dignity of a young man or woman if, after studying so many years at university, ended up not having a job, not having an income, not having a place where to live, staying with the family, and depending on pocket money? Where is the dignity of a person? I mean, to the contrary, these people started losing faith in society. So I tried to tell them that, even if you go to vocational training centers, you will guarantee a job, because we were short of, gardeners and carpenters and painters. We reversed the skills pyramid. These type of skilled jobs, they became rare. But in terms of PhDs and masters, we have the thousands of graduates. We totally reversed the skill set pyramid in the country. So part of the case for action to say, consider vocational training. You'll get immediate job and better paid than a doctor. And those of you who want still to go to university, fine. But since we cannot guarantee a job at the end of that process, we will train you a lot during the years of you studying to become an entrepreneur. And consider that as an outcome, and it's a good outcome. Don't just wait for a nice contract to come your way. And these universities are state-run, and education is free of charge. So it's very much, the obstacle was changing the mindset.
Right.
Not only of the students, but their friends and families as well.
So would you say Tunisia is now an entrepreneurial society?
I would say that I tried to sow the seeds for it, because our mandate was very short. I did the reform, I got it officially approved, and the implementation started. But it's far from being completed.
Are there any Tunisians in the room who can endorse
I think
it?
there are. I ran
Yes?
into some during the break.
Okay.
I think I have some country fellow people in the room.
Tammy, we heard in the last session that you chaired your strong clarion call, really. Well, we heard your singing, actually, more than just the clarion call. I think Tammy's promised not to sing in this session, but we heard your call for everyone to start behaving like an entrepreneur. I mean, is there a sense in which even the developed world, which knows about entrepreneurs and has the developed countries, has the similar challenges to ones that frontier nations like Tunisia have in trying to grasp this nettle?
I think we absolutely do. You know, I find myself thinking about Tom Malone's great book, The Future of Work, which was written, 10 years or so ago. If you haven't read it, it's quite interesting. And my favorite part in it is where he poses kind of a question of how would it have felt to have been a serf shortly after the invention of the printing press, if somebody came along and said to you, you know, in 100 years, you're not going to be a serf. You're going to live in a democratic republic. And he indicates his assumption that, one, the princes of the time would have thought the idea was ridiculous because clearly these serfs couldn't take care of themselves. And frankly, probably the serfs wouldn't have liked the idea. If Gallup had existed at the time, they could have gone around and surveyed the serfs, and the serfs would have said, hey, I just want a steady job here on the prince's farm. And that's, I think, a little bit where we are today. We all think, well, it couldn't happen. And we survey people, and they say, I wouldn't want it, but it's going to happen. And I actually think our question is not, how can we stop it? Our question is, how do we really have the kind of conversations we need to have about the safety nets, the role of government, the rules that will create fair play, the education that will help everyone participate? Those are the questions that I think are relevant.
So it feels a little bit as though we've moved from the first session, where there was definitely discussion early yesterday of that it's fine to be an exploiter and to have a part of your company that is exploiting the existing situation and not to necessarily worry about having everyone to be an explorer, to the point that actually, John, you made in a blog post before the conference, that everyone needs to be an entrepreneur. I mean, that's obviously what you believe, but is there not a role for people who are saying, you know, I'm just going to mine more out of the incremental improvements that I can bring through at the company where I'm working?
You know, based on the work we've done, which is looking at the long-term forces reshaping the global business landscape, our belief is we are in the early stages of a big shift that has many different dimensions to it, but a key dimension is accelerating pace of change and increasing uncertainty. And in that kind of environment, I would challenge anyone to say there is an activity that should continue to be done the way it's been done, exploiting.
Right.
I believe every activity in every institution, and by the way, not just companies, governments, schools, NGOs, every activity needs to become an exploration activity done by entrepreneurs, done by people who are creatively motivated, have the imagination and curiosity to explore new ways of doing things so they can add more value, and the commitment to actually move from the idea to action and willingness to take risk in order to do that.
But we kind of know from experience of large companies and even individual experience that taking that step is a big step to take, and one that where the comfortable, I can manage to string this job out for a little bit longer, is the more attractive prospect. So other than the kind of crisis that often triggers corporate change, what is the first step that people in this room who might categorize themselves as being in the non-entrepreneurial stage should be taking when they leave to make that leap?
And may I just ask, attractive to whom? I just wanted to make sure I understood what John was going to answer. What did you just ask, Andrew?
In the sense that there are ways in which existing roles, as an incumbent company, you may well be saying, I can go on, in Kodak's case, selling analog roll film until the moment comes, and when the moment comes, you're not prepared for it. Individuals will say, I can go on working in this area of incumbent exploitation, and I don't have to prepare to be an explorer. I may not want to be an explorer, as Rita said in an earlier session. So I'm just wondering, what is the move that people can do to make themselves ready for that, other than reading your blogs, obviously?
All my other research as well.
Yeah.
No, I think that it's a huge challenge. I think one of the things that struck me as I listened in the past 2 days is the reasonably widespread agreement among the group, and perhaps it's self-selection, but that this shift from an employee society to an entrepreneur society is a necessary shift. I think I didn't hear anybody saying we need to keep the employee society. And yet, on the other hand, I think the big question on the table is, if that is a necessary shift, why have so few institutions actually made that shift? And my belief, and I've been involved in large-scale organizational change efforts now for over 30 years, and over that time period, I've developed enormous respect for the immune system and the antibodies of every large institution. Without exception, I've never encountered an institution that doesn't have those immune systems and antibodies. And I would say that the tendency, first of all, is to go top-down, big bang approach to change, which in my experience actually amplifies the immune system. And at least the academic studies that have been done show that anywhere from 70 to 80% of those efforts have failed to achieve any of their objectives. And I think that the need, in part, is the other tendency is to focus on threat. You know, if we don't do this, we're going to die. We need to do this. My belief is the successful change efforts focus on the opportunity and try to inspire for each individual what's in it for them, why is this such an important opportunity for them, and then start with small steps that will actually demonstrate impact quickly, so that you get a reinforcing cycle that this is doable and it actually does produce a much better outcome in terms of each of us as individuals. I mean, again, I'm biased on this coming from Silicon Valley, but I believe that an entrepreneurial society is one that's going to allow every one of us to achieve much more of our potential than if we continue to just follow the tasks that have been defined for us.
Pointing to those small steps helps to get people at least on the path. Tammy, you had something to add.
Well, I wanted to ask John a question, which is, would you buy this? I kind of think part of that we're maybe being a little hard on ourselves in terms of not having made the change yet, because I would argue that we've only had the technology that enables this change to occur for about a decade. And we all know that it takes us a decade or two to assimilate any new technology. So, okay, we've started to use it in our private lives. We haven't scratched the surface in our businesses. So that's the really, to me, exciting part. We've got an opportunity right now with some fabulous new technology to fundamentally step back and rethink business. So I don't beat us up that we haven't done it in the past 10 years. My gosh, we're still trying to figure out how to turn these computers on and stuff. But now's the time. We're all ready to go. Would you buy that?
You know, I tend to have a sense of urgency and a need to do things faster than are done. I do believe that, you know, again, you can frame this in many different respects, but I joke that, you know, again, I've been in business and management for over 30 years, I can guarantee almost without exception, whatever meeting I go into, leadership meeting in whatever institution, anywhere in the world, innovation is very high on the agenda. So it has been addressed for 30 years, and it's still being talked about.
Right. We talked, there was a good point that Alex Osterwalder made about innovation theatre and the way in which people kind of will have that performance. Maëlle, you've been an entrepreneur since your teens, if we believe your bio. So, and you seem to be going into bigger and bigger companies. So you're going against the flow here a little bit, aren't you?
So first, I do believe that big companies can be incredibly entrepreneurial. I do think that actually a lot of the innovation that is happening in the world actually is happening contrary to what a lot of people believe at the state level and at big company level. So I don't see necessarily a massive opposition. I think you can be entrepreneurial within a company, and we had example yesterday of people who explained how to do that. Now, I'd like to comment on some of the things the two of you said. I'm a little worried about this black and white opposition of the employee society and the entrepreneurial society, because I fundamentally believe that it's fine for the people in this room, and obviously a lot more than just the people in this room, to move into the entrepreneurial society. We're educated. We tend to be fairly well off. We have families behind us. We usually come from Western countries where there is a very good social system. And so for us, the risk is not that big, and we look at entrepreneurship as a great way to be more successful. There is a very large chunk of population that I'm not sure is going to be that excited by this idea of becoming entrepreneurs, and I'm not sure that we are taking the right steps to help them there. And I would even go further. I'm not sure that everybody needs to be an entrepreneur. Actually, I do believe that there is a value in employees and in people who don't want to be entrepreneurs, they have other things that matter in their life other than building businesses and being innovative.
Right, I just want to bring Tawfik in. This question of how you build the bridge between the entrepreneurial and the employee and bring that into large companies is pretty critical. And it seems, Tawfik, that your experience in Tunisia was partly to do with providing bridges for people from a certainty, admittedly one that ended in a dead end, to something that gave them more opportunities. I just wondered if there's one thing you brought back from that to teach at IMD that you're now telling to people who are facing a similar, not quite as an existential fear in their large companies.
In my teaching at IMD, one of the messages is how to innovate in government. And to most people, this seems a contradiction of terms. Governments are not there to innovate. Governments are there to enforce procedures and to uphold the law, but not more. We were able to innovate within government because we needed to have a sense of urgency to deliver, back to the point that John mentioned. So we had short mandate, and we said if we rely on the line bureaucratic traditional ministries, we won't get anything or not much done by the end of our term. So what we did, we set up a separate structure. It is our explore structure. Traditional government is the exploit structure. In the separate one, it's even the design of the building, open workspace. On each floor, cross-ministerial team of young people, technology savvy. And to each team, we assigned a national project. And we said, work on it. You know what is the mission, now find the way, find the solution, test the new system. It wasn't instructions, it wasn't top-down, it wasn't enforcing procedures. It was experiment, trial and error, breakthrough innovation, as opposed to incremental change in traditional government, et cetera, et cetera. So different working culture, different type of skill set, empowerment, creativity, innovation, and technology as the enabler. So for example, reforming the national subsidy system. When we talked to traditional government agencies, they told us it will require 3 to 4 years to reform the country's subsidy system. The government lab did it in less than 1 year.
Right, right.
So again, this is learning from disruptive innovation and the work of Professor Clay Christensen, and we tried to apply it to government.
Okay.
And it worked.
I'm going to bring this back because we've got minutes to go, and bring this back one by one with Tammy first. Just on one more step for this building of the bridge that is obviously needed that Maëlle calls for. Very briefly.
Very briefly, I would just say we need to think about all the players and how we want to divide the responsibility among them. I agree with Maëlle that there are going to be people who want to work in one steady role. I totally agree with that. But what that implies is that we're going to assign responsibility for those people to business. Maybe we want to. But that's the kind of intellectual debate we should have. What do we want business to do? What do we want social entrepreneurship organizations to do? What do we want governments to do? And as we think about where the responsibility lies for various pieces, then we can have a real debate about how to build this new society.
John, quick one, just wrapping up there, where you think the first step is, or the first brick in the bridge.
I think there are many potential breaks, but one I think that's important is at the leadership level. And I would say that in the employee society, the stable institutions we have, the mark of a strong leader is someone who knows all the answers. No matter what the question is, you can guarantee that person has the answers. I believe one of the keys to transition is for leaders. The strong leaders of the future are going to be those who have the best questions, the most powerful questions, where they will actually acknowledge they don't have the answer. They need help. They're inviting help. It's an expression of vulnerability. It's a taking of risk. But if leaders are not willing to do it, why would anybody else be willing to do it?
Maëlle, 15 seconds to wrap up your final thought here.
I think it's going to be difficult to be a leader in the world of tomorrow, as per That's my 15 seconds.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank our first panel. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to invite the even more daunting second panel to join me for the second movement of this concerto. In the meantime, I was at the parallel session with the Drucker Challenge winners downstairs, and the student winner, Tanagai Mutasami, wrote in his winning essay, "An entrepreneurial society will be successful only if we prepare the right kind of people to run it and keep it going. Only if we prepare the right kind of people to run it and keep it going." And I'm pleased to say that the people we have on the panel are all educators. They're all in the business of preparing people for the entrepreneurial society. I hesitate to ask directly whether they think they've done a good job so far, given the doubts that we still have about the road to be traveled towards the more entrepreneurial feeling. But I will just briefly introduce them. You know them all: Rita McGrath, Phil Kotler, Roger Martin, Gary Hamel, and Clay Christensen. And starting with Rita, a version of the same question I asked Maëlle at the beginning of the last session: how do we go about building this better society?
Well, I think to put things in context, if you think about the human race, business and entrepreneurship have brought more people out of poverty and into lives with opportunity than practically any other force we have. So, and I think if you think of the great leaps forward that many of the countries post-World War II have made, that's been amazing. That being said, it was William Baumol, who's a very well-regarded economist, who said, you know, as a society, you can choose to have your entrepreneurial talent, and he believed that there was a more or less fixed supply of entrepreneurial talent. You can have it be productive, building new things, taking responsibility for people, creating products and services that are needed and add value. You can have it be unproductive, you know, creating more and more tchotchkes that clutter up our living rooms, and, you know, after Christmas they just sit at the side of the thing. Or you can have it be destructive, where the entrepreneurial talent turns to corruption, turns to, you know, abusing their power, turns to crime. And he very much strongly argued that we have to think about the structure of incentives in our society as to which kind of entrepreneurship we get. Because one of the things about entrepreneurs is they will go where they perceive the opportunities to be. And if those are opportunities we as a society don't think are particularly attractive, we need to make sure that we don't reward that behavior. Just 1 second on teaching entrepreneurs. The question we all get always is, can you teach entrepreneurship?
Yeah.
And my standard response is, look, I can't teach you passion. I can't teach you energy. I can't teach you the willingness to work really, really hard for what you want. But I can teach you an awful lot, like how not to make stupid mistakes, how to do discovery, what to talk to customers about, how to begin to think about those first services you might offer, and how to be unafraid of changing your mind. So there's a lot we can teach. I know at most of our schools we've been turning away from our traditional preoccupation with consulting and finance toward much more other things. Entrepreneurship at my place is a big part of that.
And Philip, you memorably proposed in one of the early sessions that there should be a Masters of Business Creation as well as a Masters of Business Administration. I don't want to get into how that might be offered, but I mean, it really is a question of show and tell in this case, isn't it? Rather than teaching from on high, handing down the tablets from the academy. I mean, people need to do this.
We found that a lot of our students in various universities want to be entrepreneurs, maybe 10 to 20, maybe 30% in some schools. And yet that requires a different training than learning how to be in a business and manage finance and the standard silos in a business. So that degree might make some sense. But if I may take this as an opportunity to tell you what schools are doing about training entrepreneurs. Out of my own experience at Northwestern University at the Kellogg School of Management, we've been coasting on our reputation for marketing. We keep getting the highest rating for school teaching marketing. And I said to our dean, others are copying us. We're going to lose that position to someone. How about a second mountain that we own? And I proposed innovation. And this was about 10 years ago that, hey, let's become, and when I mentioned it to our dean, he says, no, MIT's got that, or Stanford has that. I said, let's try for it too, because innovation and entrepreneurship are next. I prevailed. And then she said to me, can you get a program together? And I said, yes. And I ended up endowing a laboratory. So we now have a innovation laboratory. So instead of me just teaching a course on new product development, where there was no facilities, we have a huge room with 3D printers and big tables and boards we can write on the wall. And I'm creating what is an innovation center in a sense. Now, of course, I suddenly hear that Harvard has a much bigger one. It's a whole building, the Innovation Lab of Harvard. And I haven't seen Stanford's. No, I have actually. So but I really believe that by putting more of our students into project work rather than classroom sitting and hearing and listening, and of course, I hope that we get some great success, because that's all it takes to get into the New York Times, that Kellogg's Student X created Groupon or something like that, and I'm waiting for that moment.
Right, but wouldn't the people who are going to be creating that aren't they shunning the institutions, both the corporate and the university and educational
And we want
institutions?
our innovation lab not only to serve our students, but that's primary, but also to bring in companies to use our lab to help us go out to companies and establish accelerators, innovation labs for them,
right,
and build a community of entrepreneurship
so,
in Chicago.
Let me flip to the end of the line to Clay, who was looking amused and proud of the Harvard gigantic innovation lab. I don't want to spend the whole session talking about whether this can be taught, but there clearly are qualities of entrepreneurship that would, in the way we understand it, drive people away from this kind of organized entrepreneurship rather than bring them in? What is the kind of human quality that you would be trying to cultivate in a student?
Well, I'll just give you some data and then come back to say, could this be taught? So we set up a fund to invest in new companies that are not yet been created. And we developed enough money to fund them. But we said that they need to give us a business model that builds upon sound theories of innovation and growth. And if they meet the criteria so that they're using theories as they're well taught, we'll put the investment in, but if they don't, then there's something wrong with their thinking and we won't invest it. And so the critical theories are, if it's disruptive, meaning that they will kill the competitors rather than being killed by the competitors, that's one. Second, is there a job to be done? Third, as we call it, the school of experience. The management, have they seen problems like this before? And there were 2 or 3 others. And we started this in 2007. And we so far have invested in 18 companies. So we're not putting it out a lot. There are criteria they have to meet. And of the 18 that have been started, 3 have failed. The other 15 are very successful, including somebody talked about Coupang. We were the founding investor in that company. And so I believe that we can actually teach management. But it has to be based upon if this, then that. If you're in this situation, do it this way, but if you're in that situation, don't try that, So I'm more confident than I was a couple of years ago that you can actually teach it.
And do you sense that the first bit of advice to somebody saying, I want to be an entrepreneur, should be go to Harvard, go to Columbia, go to Kellogg? It doesn't sound to me like it's the kind of thing you would advise a young entrepreneur to do.
That's right. Our goal is not to make it so unique and protected that only the rich have access to that. But it needs to be so accessible that we can do it online.
Right.
And if we do it in a compelling way, I really think that it can be not perfect, but much better than it used to be.
Okay. Roger, I'll come to you and then Gary. But on this sense of kind of how do we educate is the word, obviously, that Drucker would use. How do we educate society to be more entrepreneurial? I wonder whether we have to actually teach the institutions to be more entrepreneurial before we start teaching the individuals.
Yeah, probably. But I mean, this is an interesting question for me because I sort of did a big personal experiment in this when I left a perfectly fine other life to become the dean of the Rotman School in 1998, I said at that time, I used a slightly different term, Phil, I said I really wanted it to be a Master's of Business Design, not a Master's of Business Administration. And I spent 15 years kind of working on how to make business school education more invention, creativity, innovation oriented with design, integrative thinking and the like. And I've come to the conclusion that it is far too late at that stage to have high impact. I wish it were otherwise. I'd rather have a 15-year super duper success at it. But what we've been most successful at is figuring out how to teach this to K through 12 kids. So I started an initiative there with a bunch of colleagues called I Think that does this for kids as young as 8 years old. And I think the success rate there is dramatically higher. By the time they hit a master's level education, they've been trained. They've had lots of the creativity, the interest in creating something new and different, of solving problems with new ways of doing things. They've had it largely trained out of them, and so it's the remedial work required at that to just have them say, no, now chill for a minute. We're not just asking you to choose which of these two is the better answer. We're asking you to create a new one, and it's okay. Don't freak out. Like, it's scary at that point, and it is very challenging to get professors to be interested in teaching that as well. So I've come to the conclusion that it's absolutely teachable, absolutely positively teachable, no question, but the best time to teach it is in elementary education level, which does zero of that. It's preparing them to not be creative rather than preparing them to be creative.
Phil, just briefly, and then I'll let Gary have a go. Phil?
Yes, something you said, Roger. What is the age at which someone can consciously begin to think, I will be an entrepreneur? 4 years old, 8, 10? And we spot young kids who have that entrepreneurial thing. But there is an organization called Kidzania that is creating entrepreneurs. And let me just mention it. Kidzania, a kid. From the ages of 6 on, they will go and finally learn what the world of work is like. Because they could go to Disneyland and enjoy it, but they're not learning anything. At Kidzania, of which there's 22 Kidzanias in the world, and I hope Disney doesn't take them over, and it was started by my student, Xavier Lopez. And each student who signs up, the parents bring the kids there. I want to be a pilot, and there's a plane on the grounds. Another student says, I want to run a McDonald's. And there is a McDonald's, and he does cook the hamburgers.
So it's like vocational play.
Another guy says, I want to be a policeman. And he learns what's involved. And another says, I want to be a doctor. One of them said he wanted to be a criminal. He wanted the policeman to chase him through the... So entrepreneurship is getting to be a conscious idea in kids now. It reminded me of what you said, and I just want most of you to take your grandchildren to Kidzania, because they'll be entrepreneurs that way.
Okay, thank you, Phil. I can't contain Gary any longer. Gary?
Yeah, that was hard. No, first of all, I have to say I absolutely agree with Clay and Rita and Roger for sure. This is something you can teach. You know, years ago, I got very interested in the question of, why do some people see opportunities in the world that other people miss, even though we all have the same data, we all have, and so we went and talked to 100 entrepreneurs at the time, people like Richard Branson and so on, and of course, what you learn is that they're not like superhuman in some way, but they have a set of perceptual habits, a way of looking at the world, and you can teach people. And we've taught tens of thousands of people how to be business innovators, created tens of billions of dollars of new market value, so this is not a mystery, right, number one. But I'd like to, a little bit like Clay, let me see if I can ground this in a little bit of data, because we're talking about how do we build an entrepreneurial society, presumably not for the sake of entrepreneurship, but for the sake of economic dynamism that creates jobs, that better deploys society's resources, that creates more opportunity. And the fact of the matter is, our economies are right now moving the other way. A huge stream of research from Robert Gordon and others that say our economies are becoming less dynamic. I'll give you just a little bit of data. Between 2005 and 2014, in the United States, the number of net new jobs created was 700,000 less than it was in 1985 to 1994. You look across certainly the developed world, industrial concentration is higher right now than it has been in 100 years. Big companies control more markets, more market share than they have for 100 years. If you look at productivity growth across the OECD, it is badly lagging. Over the last 5 years in the EU, productivity growth has been less than 1% a year. That means 70 years before we can double incomes. And George Osborne, the outgoing Chancellor of the Exchequer of the UK, said, changing slumping productivity is the challenge of our lifetime. It is the only way we grow standards of living. It's the only way we push back against increasing economic disparities. It is the only answer to populism. So I would just throw now a couple of thoughts. If indeed that's the fundamental challenge, then one thing we may want to do is go back and look what led to the last great inflection point in human productivity, which was the Industrial Revolution. And when you go back and you unpack that, you find that the Industrial Revolution was not about the steam engine, electric motor, and so on. It had almost nothing to do with technology. The Industrial Revolution grew in ground that had been watered and fertilized and tilled for 200 years by Enlightenment thinkers who together, Spinoza, Descartes, Voltaire, Montesquieu, Smith, and so on, who challenged a set of beliefs that had been unchallenged for almost all of human history, that time was circular and therefore that progress is impossible, that sovereigns rule by divine right and therefore there is no social mobility, that trade is zero-sum game, so the goal is to beggar thy neighbor, and that commerce is ignoble, so, you know, why go into business? And those beliefs had imprisoned an extraordinary amount of human capability, and I think even the Enlightenment thinkers had no idea of what would happen when you started to shift those beliefs and the kind of imagination that would come. And so one of the questions I'd like us maybe to think about today is, are we in some sense hostage by a similar set of beliefs? Is there another Échange regime that in some way needs to be challenged? And, you know, and are we really on the side of change, or are we on the side of the status quo? Because, you know, what produced the Industrial Revolution was, first of all, a revolution of the mind. And I would just posit a few beliefs that maybe are still fairly deeply embedded in most organizations that we can challenge very, very quickly. One is that employees are instruments. You know, I still think most leaders, most companies' idea is the institution hires the employee to create products and services. I would turn that 100% around. Individuals join a community, which may be a startup, may be a company, and they join that community to make a difference in the world. But when you start thinking about human beings, or not as employees, not as instruments, and you think about them as agents, pathfinders, activists, entrepreneurs, it totally changes your view. I think the second view that has to change is that leaders preside rather than that leaders serve. And, you know, on the web and, you know, certainly among this next generation, the digital natives, you are a leader only if you have followers. Leadership is the absolute reciprocal of followership, and all power trickles up, not down. And that's a powerful idea, but yet I think we still have a lot of noblesse oblige in organizations and a view that leaders. I would say a third belief that we have to change is that resources are allocated, that there's some smart people in our organizations that know where the new opportunities are, that can make the big bets. If you look at, you know, what makes a market economy vibrant, why is the New York Stock Exchange outperformed every company on the New York Stock Exchange for the last 50 years, is because it believes that resources are attracted, not allocated. They're attracted by new ideas. You have a highly decentralized way of moving resources behind new things, and yet in our organizations, we still manage resource allocation, not like Kickstarter, but like the Soviet Union. And then the last belief I think we may have to challenge is that you can't manage without managers. And I think we have to start to see managing not as a role, but as an activity that anyone can play anywhere in an organization. So I have great hopes for the entrepreneurial society. Right now, the fact of the matter is we are going the other way. And I think if we're going to change that, there's a revolution of the mind that has to precede whatever we may do with technology or anything else.
There's a question on the screen here come from the audience about whether we need ethical leaders as much as entrepreneurial ones, which I don't think is in opposition, actually. But I wonder, Rita, whether leadership is where this starts. Clearly, there are individual steps, as we learned in the first half of the panel, which people can take individually to move towards becoming more entrepreneurial, to learn to become more entrepreneurial. How much of this is can be and ought to be a top-down process of moving?
Well, leadership doesn't necessarily have to be top down. I mean, I think you can find leaders in many, many places, and there's a lot of evidence that the situation sometimes causes enormously powerful leaders to emerge. You know, what's the old line? Great things are called for greatness in people. So I think there's a question of being willing to take a certain leap of faith and say, as a person mobilizing other people, I can bring people along with me. You know, a great example of this would be Gandhi and the Great Salt March, which many of you will have heard of. And it was basically his demonstration of very personal, very personal leadership that said, look, we're going to collectively go and demonstrate why we're going to be able to challenge what at that time was regarded as a perfectly normal colonial regime in India. So I think there's an element of finding the right message for yourself as a leader and then bringing others along with you, not in a kind of a top-down bureaucratic way, but in an inspiring way.
Do you detect this change among your students, the ones who are obviously looking to reach high places, that they are working in a different way from perhaps a more ethical way, as the question implies?
Yeah, I mean, we have a huge interest among our students in social venturing. We have a startup lab where people can go and kind of co-work with each other and support each other on things. Certainly our students are asking a lot more questions about what's ethical, what's right, what's the kind human thing to do, even if not necessarily the illegal thing to do. Let's avoid those behaviors. So we're seeing a lot more interest among our students in being just leaders, being ethical leaders, as well as being successful leaders.
Right. Let me focus in on the how part of this with the last few minutes that we have of the session and indeed of the conference, because we want to go not literally in a Tammy Erickson way singing the song of the final session, but we do want to leave people with some things that they will go on and out to do. And I think it's indisputable that over the years, even of the Drucker Forum, we've talked about these things a lot, but change has come still quite slowly, and we're now reaching points of crisis in various areas, political and corporate, which suggests that perhaps that is the only way to change, even though, as Gary suggested during his session earlier, that it's a third world dictatorship way of changing. So what's one how thing, one practical thing that people can do? And I'll throw that to Clay, first of all.
Well, there was a theme here which I was delighted to see. I'll give it some context. A number of years ago, a gentleman came to Boston on a Fulbright scholarship, and he was a Marxist economist from China. And he came to study democracy, of all of the strange topics. And we got to know him quite well. And as we came to the end of his year, we invited him to dinner. And Christine and I asked him, so of all the things that you learned about democracy while you were in Boston, is there anything that just surprised you that you'd never thought about before? And without any hesitation, he said, yeah, I had no idea how critical democracy is to the functioning of religion. And I never put these things together. But it's like this guy parachutes in from Mars, and this is what he observes. That democracy doesn't work unless you have, as a foundation, religion. And he said there are really two ways to create a peaceful and prosperous nation. One is to be Singapore, where you have somebody who is in charge and everybody follows the rules. But he said the other option is democracy. And the problem with democracy is it's organized so that the government doesn't oversee everything that we do. But it works because in our past, we were taught by people that we believed that we need to voluntarily choose to obey the laws because the system won't demand it of us. We have to voluntarily choose to obey the law. And there was a time in our past when our religions instilled that into us. So we had responsibility not to society, but God will hold us accountable. And because we were taught that we should voluntarily choose to obey the law, democracy works and capitalism works. And when we have tried in any degree of length to create capitalism or democracy without that foundation, life has been a very tenuous endeavor. And I think that at least we have words in this discussion yesterday and today that we need to truly bring in this sense that we are accountable to somebody higher than society, that we need to hold ourselves or to have God hold us accountable.
Which will help to hold together a society that might break off into more entrepreneurialism without control at some point.
That's right.
Gary, do you have one thing that you want to take away or give away here?
Well,
to the,
first, I want to 100% agree with what Clay just said. You know, if you go back and you read Adam Smith or you read de Tocqueville, all of them said that free markets, open markets, democracy cannot exist without a deep moral foundation. And one of the questions I think, certainly as Western society, we have to ask is, how over time do we refresh that moral capital, that spiritual capital, which in many ways may be eroding? Let me not go any further than that.
No, it is eroding.
It is eroding. So I agree. But you asked maybe a specific how. Let me try to give one specific how. I think there are a lot of people in organizations today who think the idea of changing these big organizations, making them more flexible, more creative, and more inspiring places to work, that challenge seems to them like that should be somebody else's problem. There's an incredible amount of learned helplessness in organizations, and I see this in a lot of conferences I go to, not necessarily this one, but you'll see CEOs get up there and talk about some amazing thing they did in their organization. You go like, well, wow, that's interesting, you're the CEO. And then you have people, maybe like some of us out of academia or whatever, who will tell people how to be more effective in your role, how to be a better leader, how to be a better manager. What you almost never hear is somebody telling you how to change the system when you don't own the system, right? How do you change HR, finance, IT, whatever, when that's controlled, by people, somewhere up in the corporate tower? But if you have that sense of helplessness, you will never change anything. And back to what Rita said, deep change never has started top down. It just doesn't happen that way. It happens from activists. I think maybe when I was here last time, I told this story, I won't tell it now, but two people in the middle of Britain's National Health Service, one of the largest, 1.7 million employees, who without a single permission launched what would become the single greatest change program in 65 years history of the NHS. And you can go read about this and so on. Jackie Linton and Helen Bevan are their names. And so for me, you have to start thinking about yourself as an activist.
There's consciousness that when inside the company you can change something even without permission.
But here would be my simple rule, Andrew. A lot of people come to me, they know I'm talking to the leadership, and they'll say, Gary, will you get this message across? I usually say no. I say, here's the thing. Before you ever try to take an idea up in your organization, go sideways. See if you can build a coalition, build a white paper, get something online, and start something, because it's very easy for leaders to say no to one person. It's almost impossible to say no to 10 or 20 or 30. And, I
Gary,
just find it ironic.
I'm going to have to round you off there just to give the others a chance. But
think like an activist.
Point well taken. Activist thinking. Roger? In 1 minute?
Yeah, 1 minute now, we're down to, okay. What? So I would say it's in your daily life, make an effort to fight the reductionist tendencies that scientific thought has brought us. I guess I think about the world that for every time the bright sunlight shines warmly on your face, there's a shadow behind you. And the age of reason, the scientific revolution brought us great things, but it brought us a big problem, and that's a reductionism that has continued to apace to this day. You ask, why don't you have ethical leaders? Reductionism. I've excluded that from my equation. Why do you not think about corporate social responsibility? Because I've excluded that from my equation. Why are there 1,000 partial equilibrium economists for every general equilibrium economist? Because of reductionism. And I think it's a force that we've got to recognize. We've got science and reason going for us, but it pushes us to be reductionist, and virtually all the problems in the world that need solving require you to step back from reductionism and consider more things salient to your consideration.
Philip?
1 minute.
And very brief.
I just wondered about a problem. If I ran a company, would I be happy if everyone in the company was an entrepreneur? I think of, you remember when scientists were added to companies, they were very hard to manage. So would it be chaos in a company full of entrepreneurs? Is there a principle that would produce some order in that company? And the fact is, I started the opposite way, thinking I want lots of people to be entrepreneurial in my company. And I'm wondering if I'm creating a management problem.
Can we leave it as that question, or do you have an answer for the question?
Well, the thing is, there's answers. For example, Google must be pretty much the answer.
Right.
They're full of people who are doing
okay, I'm
dozens of
I'm going to
projects.
have to wind you up there. Rita, last word. You get the last word of the conference.
Awesome at the conference. I would say be your own best coach. And that means very simply, decide on how you want to get better, in what area. Go out and try a few things, get feedback, use that feedback to create your next set of action steps.
Great. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank our panel.